Hello and welcome. My name is Trismegistus, and today we're going to be reading through and speculating about the brand new Factorio Friday Facts. Friday Facts 377, New Rails, posted by V. Hello, there are certain areas in Factorio that we haven't really had the courage to change for a long time. One of those areas has been the rail system. The rail system needs change. Whenever playing the game, we'll be reminded about two annoyances that are caused by technical limitations. So-called S-bends are not possible. Two parallel rails would need at least 6 tiles in the perpendicular direction in order to connect. It then gives an example of this. If you've ever played Factorio, you're familiar with this and the annoyances associated with this, but they're trying to sort of explain it in a nice simple way. It's a really good diagram explaining it actually. Caption says, how many times has it happened to you that two of your rails wouldn't be able to easily connect? Example it's showing here is because there is this single S-bend, you obviously have to go one way with the S-bend, or the single curve, and it's a single geometry, single radius to the curve. And so basically you have to go one way and then the other way, and because of the size of that, which happens to be 4 tiles, because you've then got 2 of them, that's 8 tiles, so you're going 2 tiles there, 2 tiles there, and you have to have this gap in the middle. So there is no way, unless you do, like weird curves and take it round on itself, to get this train onto this line, basically. And it is an annoyance. It's something you end up learning to work around, but it is a little bit annoying. And essentially, that's what they're fixing. Signal positions are often very restrictive as soon as curved rails cross any other rail, so building junctions is a lot of trial and error to see if you can signal it properly. Here we're showing that they're trying to place a normal rail signal on the curve, but they can't do it because the curve restricts the positions where signals are allowed. Therefore, they can't properly signal this junction. Obviously, proper is up to you to judge, but they can't properly signal the rail in their opinion. And it says, how many times did you need to restructure an intersection because you couldn't place signals inside? Yeah, that's very true. It doesn't let you place certain signals, and so you may have to redesign any junction that you've made. It's one of the reasons that templated blueprints for rail systems are very useful, because it lets you just work out the problem once and then just reuse it. It does lead to inorganic, very artificial looking rail systems, which we'll kind of come on to that. I'm very much looking forward to these changes. Apart from this, the code of the rail system accumulated some technical debt over time, like 1. Hard-coded connectivity rules, 2. Hard-coded rail planner logic, 3. Curved rail being the only entity with multiple bounding boxes, 4. Diagonal rails had front and back signal positions overlapping. Boskid was more than keen to rewrite large sections of the underlying rail code, as one of the many benefits would be that we could easily define pretty much any rail shape. This was a prime opportunity to think really hard about solutions. If we were to update the rail system, it would have to improve all of the major problems in a convincing way. The S-bend. Adding an S-bend piece sounds like a very simple change. It would be just a special piece which would allow you to offset tracks by 2 tiles. It works on a 2x2 grid rather than the 1x1 grid. The reason for that is because otherwise, well, it's a design decision in the sense that they want to be able to have, chunky looking rails. So they want the entity to look big, like a assembler is a 3x3 size. They want the rail to be 2x2. If they allowed it to be positioned 1 tile, where it's a 2 tile object, as it were. So each rail section is 2x2. If they allowed you to place that on a 1x1 grid, you would be able to half overlap the rail, which would mean that a rail would be able to be done halfway down the rail, if you see what I mean. So you would be able to overlap those so that it looked like there was a continuation. And then next time roll over, because of how they've done the graphics, it wouldn't look like it overlap. But technically, when you put it in the next one, you'd end up with this continuous stream of rails. It would look very weird, but also cause some very strange situations where half-track trains would be able to crash into each other, and it would get very messy. So they've restricted to this 2x2 grid because it's a 2x2 tile, basically. So when they say an S-bend is simply a a new piece, theoretical piece, that would be able to connect between one piece of rail and the piece of rail next to it. So it only moves over two, and if you recall, that's in contrast to this system where they have already, where it has to go all the way down 6 tiles, as they call it, or I tend to think of it as 8. And it says, let yourself dream for a moment and enjoy the idea of how beautiful an S-bend like this would be. But as always, when it comes to Factorio, things are never simple. All 5 of these directions would need to connect to a single rail piece. But yeah, the point is that that one single piece of rail, it's then got lots and lots of different directions to go. And as I say, if you're driving the trains, that means you can't select the right path, because left doesn't mean, it means one of 3 options. But also for trains making decisions and signalling this, it's not actually any better, because where would you put the signals on these curves? You couldn't. You'd have to signal it all the way down here. And there's all sorts of issues that they explain about this. But basically, this is the point, that you go from having 3 potential connection points, left, right, straight, to left a bit more, even more, right a bit more, right even more than that. So it becomes very messy. At the moment, every rail can connect to at least 3 directions, left, straight, right. Adding a special piece would either make curves incompatible with S-bends, you could only build one, not both on the same spot, which would be a technical limitation, unobvious to the player why. So they're basically saying that, you could have a coded in rule that says you can't put both of these junctions on, which the player wouldn't, why would that happen? Or require 2 more connections, S-bend left, S-bend right, which would mean that rail performance would suffer because of more options, and also that when you manually drive a train, arrow keys would not be enough to clearly decide where you want to go. That's what I was trying to explain before, basically, that when the train, the pathing for the train is working out which way to go, it's got a lot more options to go through, because you could have a really complex train network, that's weaving around. A lot of players don't do this, obviously, but there's nothing stopping you, having paths going all over. I'll come back to that in a minute, but nothing having you paths going all over, and so that the rail path solver would end up getting stuck probably. And it gets worse, because adding just a single S-bend special piece would not be enough. Offsetting rails by 2 tiles is nice, but maybe even more important is a 4-tile offset, which would be achievable by building 2 or more of the 2-tile offsets in a row. But that would be, just have a look. I'm not entirely sure if this needs words, but I believe to a lot of us this is nightmare fuel delivered by pixels. So what it's referring to here is basically that because you're allowing this S-bend, which would connect a rail there to a rail there, if you simply do 2 of those in a row, then you can connect from there, that piece to that piece, which is filling this gap in here. So basically, 1 S-curve gets us to there, 2 S-curve gets us to there, the other piece, assuming this curve remained, would get you to the further part. And then obviously you can imagine that if you wanted to go here, you would put in an S-bend. If you wanted to go there, you might have 2 S-bends. So basic point is that, and this is an aesthetic thing really, when you think about it, it looks horrendous. Although if you've ever travelled on the British rail system, this wiggling back and forth of rails is pretty much the standard. Good old privatisation, eh? The idea. So it came to the conclusion that it might be ideal to split the curve in half, allow opposite curves to connect to each other, forming an S-bend, and allowing signals to be placed in the middle. Plus, we would add half-diagonal directions to rails, which could extend the S-bend as much as we want. So the caption says, half-diagonal rail between 2 half curves, any length S-bend. They're proposing that there's a kind of half curve, so it doesn't go the full 45-degree turn. It does a 22.5-degree turn, and it's also not the S-bend. It's not these 2 pieces connected together. It's cut in half. They're then also saying that they would introduce a kind of a straight piece that is appropriate to that curve. So it's at an angle of essentially 22.5 degrees rather than 45 degrees. So basically you introduce a new straight bit that's at a different angle as well as these 2 half curves, and that kind of lets you just build it as you want. This idea is great and all, but how do we put it into tiles, rail shapes and actual graphics? The geometry. All of the above sounds excellent on paper, but when it comes to the implementation, geometry is merciless. There is one main rule that even the new rail implementation adheres to. Every connection point has to be located on an integer grid coordinate. This is necessary to make rail planner and rail signal positions work reasonably simply. The straight tracks are easy to make, but it's the curves which are difficult when we can only move the control point by entire tiles. Cutting the curves in half would add control points in places which make it impossible to make the curve look nice. Have a look how jagged the new rail shape candidate curve would be. So before I go into this, just to explain, the control points are the integer grid. If you've ever seen a piece of grid graph paper where it's just a series of squares, and in fact the thing in the background is what they're talking about as the grid. If you imagine this gets like the grass and desert and what have you overlaid over the top of it, but behind it all is this grid basically. And what you'll notice, they've used these before. They're really, really good for illustrating some of these points. So this is the underlying curve that ends up being proposed, is what they're showing there. And this is what's going on sort of behind the hood, as it were. So the control points that they're talking about are the integer grid connection points. So you see how that is aligned with that grid. And this one here is as well. And I can show you that by doing out the thing. So you see they've got this point there with the cross of the two squares is where the control point is. And similarly, this control point is aligned with that one. This control point is aligned with that. And then that control point is aligned with that square crossing there. And of course that one there is the end point. And we've got one at the very end here. So for what they're saying is that for simple straight rail, of course, you're just simply connecting the dots in a straight line. So it's really, really simple. For curved rail, because they want it to be a curve and not just a straight that's at an it's not just a bend, it's a curve round a new shape. When you're trying to define the points where you want these control points to be, so the integer connection points, you have to bear in mind that you're going to have to, if you're doing a curve, then you're not really mapping one point, you're having to map several. And so what they're trying to show here is this diversion from 1.1 rail. So the current rail system is this underlying graphic here, and it's a nice smooth curve. But if you start having to say, right, well, we want a control point. So I wonder if I can work out where the control point is for the... So if that's if that's the old curve of the rail, then the control point must be there. Yeah? So that's the same control point, basically, between the two. It's just that they're introducing a new one, so a new halfway point, that if you look at the curve of the old rail, which is what's being shown in the sort of underlying diagram, they don't care with that curve whether it hits this control point, because this would be the midpoint control point if it had to adhere to the control points. But because it's a curve between two other points, it doesn't matter. They can just draw it where they want to draw it. Whereas the new one, you're making the half curve shorter, and you need to have the two endpoints for the old curve need to be hit, but the midpoint needs to hit an integer value. And of course here, it didn't. The midpoint for the old curve was, I don't know, somewhere here maybe. And it's just a reflection of the fact that it's going, instead of 45 degrees, it's 22.5 degrees, which means you're not going to get perfect triangles, basically. So they're trying to force a perfect triangle, a 1-4 triangle, in this case, so it's going down 1 and across 4. That gives them a nice integer point, but it means the curve is a bit naff. And this is the curve you end up with. And it's not really a curve, it's more like a bend to one point, a bend to there, and a bend. Just see what I mean? It's not a smooth curve. So they don't like that result. Classic Factorio stuff, really, that, something that works isn't good enough. It's got to be, got to be perfect. This is in part because there are just too many control points. Since the diagonal triangles are both weird to build with in general and pose a lot of geometrical difficulties, I was extremely happy to attempt to let them go. Unfortunately, as you can see below, the middle of such a curve would end up in the centre of a tile, which isn't an allowed position to define. so this won't work either. You can also notice that while the curve is now much smoother in the middle, at the ends it's still a lot sharper than one-to-one rails were, which doesn't quite look like a natural circle either. So again, we're doing a comparison between the old rail system and the new points that you would have. And what they're basically saying is it's still got the same control points for the curves, it's just they're not bothering with the straight bit, basically. So this diagonal, the bit in green at the top here, is a straight piece of rail. And what they're essentially saying is that rather than bother doing that, you would have a 1-4 triangle, but it ends up with a control point, an integer in the middle, and of course they can't allow that because then you would be able to build on a 1-by-1 grid. They're also saying that these curves are a bit too sharp. Again, it's more of an aesthetic one, that. This means that we've kind of run out of options to make a nice curve, or at least with this curve radius. But what if we try to make the curve bigger? In fact, just the smallest radius increment from 11 to 13 tiles helps tremendously. The edge pieces are a section of a perfect circle, and the middle control point is on integer grid coordinates. The final shape of the rail curve that we've settled on. It's nice and smooth and doesn't need any triangles or other straight sections in the middle. The answer isn't to go smaller, it's to go bigger, and to rather than have the rail pieces try to mimic what the old rail pieces did. In other words, what they were trying to go for in the original design here, or the original suggestion, was something, you see how they're mapping it to the old curve and saying, right, it's effectively saying the old pieces were 2, so what we need is a 1 piece, that if you add 2 1 pieces together, you get a 2 piece. If you've ever played scale electrics or used actual hobby railway, you'll be familiar with that, where you've got, this is your straight piece of rail, or this is your curved piece of rail, and then you have half pieces that are sort of, you can just stick those together and get the exact same rail piece, or scale electrics track, or what have you. So, or slot cars, I suppose, is a generic term. But yeah, that's what they're trying to look at in this design. And what they're actually saying is, let's just abandon the design. Because if we make it bigger, not that much bigger, just a bit bigger, then you can get completely consistent pieces, nice and smoothly, and obviously these connect together, and presumably, if that piece was connected to another one of those, then it's going to curve back, so it's going to go one across like that to there, so then it's gone over by that 2 tiles, so it's still that S-bend approach that they're after, it's just that it controls round. But obviously that means these are bigger pieces of rail, they're not going to fit to the same, or the same setup as the old rail. New Factorio 2.0 rails. The curve size increase is minimal, but still not insignificant. However, in practice, it's surprisingly not so problematic. For example, a T-junction footprint generally remain the same thanks to the additional signal positions. So this is where these slidey diagrams are really, really helpful. So basically this is what a T-junction design might look like in Factorio 1.1. Obviously you can design it however you want, sort of thing, but this is a fairly compact T-junction in Factorio 1.1. This is what it looks like in Factorio 2.0. Factorio 1.1 is obviously what we're playing on at the moment, and 2.0 is what we're getting. That's the big update version that will come with Space Age. As you can see, the footprint, which is to say the size of this blueprint, is exactly the same. And the point is that they're making is that these new rail pieces are bigger, yeah, so that they can do the better curve. But, and this, I don't know if they do actually properly explain this, but it's because they've added more connection points for the signals, basically. So your signals here, in the old version, have to be on the straight bits. As it turns out that this is a diamond, a triangle rather. So it's actually connecting to the triangle. It's not really connecting on the actual curve. Whereas here, I think they did say this, that they're going to allow more connection points. But either way, that is the 2 curves connecting, so it's at the end of the curve. But I think they're allowing signals on some of the curve, is what I've sort of understood this to mean. And basically, even though this curve is, bigger, you see how they connect here, they cross right at the intersection, where there's a tiny little triangle in the middle there. And that's what they're saying. Basically, the curve is different, but because they allow more signal connection points, it sort of doesn't make any difference. You don't have to put the rails a bit further apart in order to give yourself places to signal, because they allow more signal connection points. And they do, if you notice, there are some changes as well. They discuss these later on with the graphics, and I really like this. The tweaks, it's small stuff, but they're a bit clearer. What they've particularly done is adjusted the shadows and the rail itself. I don't know if you can see, so the sleepers that are the bits of wood that the rail rests on, they get very messy and indistinct here in the curve, and they're a lot clearer because the shadowing is just ever so slightly better. And also the rail itself is a bit thin. It's it's almost like it's a tube of metal, whereas if you've ever seen a railway, it's a thick piece, and it's obviously shaped and stuff. But this is a lot clearer, and well, I'm sort of preempting what they're going to say, but they've basically done that to make it clearer when you zoomed out, that you can see the rail properly. They've also tweaked the graphics for the end stops, so the bumpers, basically, that the train would hit, if it was real rail. And this is a sort of a cleaner and sort of sharper design, basically. It's also slightly more compact, I guess, because the curve's more extreme. But yeah, I quite like the little tweaks to the graphics. I cut the signals don't look any different to me, but maybe they have just tweaked those as well. But yeah, it's sort of more realistic, I guess, more clearly defined for the rail, which I really like. So the next diagram then is sort of showing all of the rail pieces. We still have the 45 degree, I think. That must be the 45, is it? That's there, and then you've then got a new version of a straight piece that you can use to connect. This was sort of saying about making any shape S-bend that you want. They still need that straight piece. The point is that you've now got lots and lots of rail options, and the caption says, our toy trains are getting to choose from a whole lot of different rail pieces to run on. It's still a single curved rail point piece, but it's now at a shallower curve, which means you can do more connections with it. You don't have those weird bits where you can't go 2 tiles over unless you do a big loop round, because now this curve allows you to do that. The new curves and half diagonals allow for much more nuanced shapes, so getting through narrow gaps is much easier. Obviously, this shows the general pattern of the railway. I will be totally honest, this curve seems a bit sharp when it's in the real world, but I think that's simply because it's just something we're not used to. It's actually shallower, it looks like a sharp curve for some reason. I guess it's because the old curve, which I think must be sort of recreated here effectively, which is actually, and it's sort of longer is the point, that the old curve would probably end sort of here-ish or something. But basically this curve, I mean, that looks a lot smoother that way, but the little diagonal there looks sharper. But I think it's just an optical illusion. Anyway, the real point of what they're trying to show is this gap between these two cliffs. Here you've got a very, very narrow gap. You would be able to get a train through there normally. It's not that the point is you couldn't have got a train through there. It's just that you would have had to build the entire system around that intersection, that pass, because you would have been limited to a 45 degree piece of rail. And connecting that, you would only have the one curve. So your rail, curve would probably have to go through there. It would therefore be interfering with all of this. It would probably have to connect to this, which makes signalling more complicated. So, and that station, would have had to have been punted further over. So it would have been an absolute nightmare. One of the things I'm slightly hoping that this does is alleviate the cliffs issue a little bit, because rail with cliffs is one of the particular problems. It's obviously, cliffs are particularly annoying, to build with generally, particularly when you're building big. But rail is just a nightmare with cliffs. You just have to, you can't, you've got little gaps like this, you almost can never use them, because, finding gaps that align with the rail grid and you can actually pass through and that you can curve round and is basically impossible. If you wanted to do this in normal game, what you'd probably actually be doing, if you wanted to keep the cliffs, you'd have to, blow some of them up no matter what. But with this new system, setting aside, 2x2 versus whatever the grid system is for the rail, putting it through little gaps like that is going to be much more feasible. So I'm hoping that maybe cliffs aren't quite as annoying in 2.0. but we'll have to see. Building 4 or 6 tile gaps between track directions is now even more interesting to decide between, with 2 tile gaps now being possible. This, in the middle, kind of what all rail systems ends up looking like. And I think this is going to be the really big win from this system, in that you could certainly have done this, the 6 tile gap, so the bigger gap. What's really interesting is this, the smaller piece. This gives you the option of putting like roboports down the middle, which, okay, I've done that so rarely. It is useful when you're trying to expand, and this is more interesting to me because we can just have, as I say, being British and left-hand drive, all of these signals would probably be in the same side of me. Although it's actually showing a sort of a two-directional rail system, which is quite interesting. But so the signals will be inside. At the moment you have to have this big gap. So I always put the power pole there as well. So this side, but here we can have the power pole, nice and tightly compact together, with the rails as with the signals as a separate thing, and it sort of looks a lot nicer to me. It's also a lot more compact. You can probably do a lot more with a system like this. So I'm really quite excited about having a rail like that that's viable, and you can do curves on, can do junctions on, etc., etc. So this I'm sort of most interested in. The bigger one, not so much. Well, actually, we'll come back to what I'm most excited about later on, but yeah. Okay, so this next diagram caption reads, "There's enough candidate signal positions even when times get desperate." You can also notice that the rail segment visualization has been changed. Now it shows the signal directions. Yes, so my interpretation from earlier, I think, is what I was basing this on. I think what they're saying is that the curve now allows signals, and it didn't before, or perhaps it allowed one in the middle. I can never remember, but basically there are more positions where you can put signals on, and that's what they're saying earlier on about that even though the curve is bigger, because there's more signal points, you can still achieve a nice tight junction. So I think that's what they're really kind of getting at, is that there are lots more. Obviously you got the normal position here, but these curves allow for a lot more signal points, which means that you can still get nice tight junctions together. The direction thing is interesting, basically. So what that's sort of saying is that they've now put these little arrows on. I've no idea. This feels like one of those subtle little changes that's going to be massively useful for new players, or veterans as well, I guess. But basically, this is saying that if you're putting a rail signal here, because the idea is this is when you're holding a rail signal, it gives you this view. And you're trying to place a signal, and you can see here instantly that this piece of track is signalled for this direction, so it goes to this point, goes to here, and that's the only viable route a train can take. Whereas this full stop thing shows basically that a train it's signalled so that trains can go multi-direction. So a train can go one direction here. That's a one-directional piece, which, if you play the game a lot and you're familiar with rails, that's what the signals on the right mean, that the train can only travel in that direction. Whereas this piece, you've got a mix. You've got a train can go this direction up to here, and then it can go in that direction. So I think actually this isn't a viable piece of rail, because a train can't actually go anywhere unless there's another signal, that can control it. So trains would end up sat sort of opposite each other. But yes, this one shows loads of signal connection points. So yeah, this is a good improvement overall, and I say I'm really excited to get my hands on it. In fact, there are so many signal positions that junctions with 2 tiles in between are a possibility now. Though if your Factorio friends have gotten used to a 32 by 32 modular rail blueprint, they might not tolerate this. So this is showing essentially a sort of a wacky rail junction. I mean, it's not wacky, but this is a more complicated organic sort of a rail system. A lot of us, you end up with fairly standard ways of doing things, particularly because of the curve. That curve system kind of locks you into doing things in a certain way, and you don't want to create junctions that have log jams or don't work, so you end up blueprinting a thing and just going with it. This new curve looks like it allows you to do a heck of a lot new. I love this bit in particular, where you got a sort of smooth curve and a sort of a straight bit curve. That looks really cool to me. Speaking of which, the bigger curve radius means that with 4 tiles in between directions, now the minimal convenient blueprint module size is 32 by 32 tiles. We have increased the big electric power pole range to 32 to go along with this. And this shows this here. This is a sort of stealth drop of a huge change. It's been a bit of an issue in the game, an inconvenience in the game, that the big electric power pole, I think Roboports, I've always perceived this, maybe it was wrong, but Roboports are sort of a chunk, so it's like the 32 by 32 piece. And so what you end up doing with Roboports is you end up having like more Roboports. If you're trying to bridge a gap, across between 2 parts of your factory with Roboports, you end up having to put more Roboports in because the power poles are a lot shorter than the Roboport range. And so that's what happens. Basically, you have a bigger range on your Roboports than you do on the power poles. So you sort of end up really annoying, mismatch. And this is saying that these allow a bigger distance between them to connect. It's also improved, I think, with quality as well. I think you get 1 extra tile for quality levels. So not only are we getting longer power poles, which I don't know, people sort of dismissed it, but to me it was a huge improvement. It was like, extra range on the power poles meant no more really annoying, designs. Because even just quality 1, which is super easy to get, gives you 1 extra tile. But this now, basically, they've extended the range. I'm wondering, this was, and I know the Reddit and stuff got really excited about this, but I'm wondering if this is going to be followed up with a thing in that the Roboports have an even bigger range or something like that. I say, my suspicion that we're getting sort of a level 2 of robotics. These might, you still might have this, I've got to put loads more Roboports than I need in because the power poles don't reach thing. But yeah, so this was like a stealth drop of a really, huge improvement. If you rework an entity, you better also rework its remnants. As a bonus, they also have fuzzy edges, so when rail remnants end, they don't look as out of place as before. So again, just really nice artwork again. I've always say I really love the Factorio style and what they do with pixel art and how they do it. I can't really comment on, I never really thought the rail remnants looked bad before, but I'll take their word for it that these are improved. What if I woke you up from your dreams since the beginning of the post and told you this is reality? Nice little thing. These questions are really good, actually. I think they should keep this style going. I grew up reading a magazine called Omega Power, and it had a very irreverent, comedic, sort of style to it. And the captions in particular always used to be really funny for me. A lot of it was like fourth wall breaking and stuff like that. But yeah, I quite like, these sort of cheeky humour type captions are really, really good, I think. More of those, please. But yeah, so this would be impossible in the game. Go right to the beginning. This is the fix for this fact that you can't connect these pieces of rail. You now can, and you can do more, it's showing. So you just keep going, you can just keep adding them on, and it's all nice and smooth together. If you didn't want these junctions quite as close, you could probably move them down a bit. You could have the rail coming across there or what have you, but this looks amazing. It's also particularly good for me because I've always had this issue of, I do this sort of stacker where it's like a big loop, and it's sort of a forced on thing because you can't fill in the gaps. You end up with that, 2x2, that, this here. You end up, if you want to put a stacker on here, basically you end up with this shape that means that it's gigantic and it's got this huge gap and it's all horribly space inefficient. And I've always struggled with doing stackers that were better, basically, and used diagonals more. And this looks like it's just going to fix that problem for me. I can just do my type of stacker with a load of rail and it just all fits together. Probably need a bit more space that way, but you can just do infinite number now, and it's continuous. There's no gigantic great gap where you can't put trains on, or you can't put pieces of rail on. You can just do it however you want. Graphics process. The graphics of the new rails are something I'm particularly proud of. Reworking rails for visual improvement wasn't the goal, and nobody was really complaining about the high resolution rails. But can I say, I really like working on rail graphics, so I took this opportunity to make the rails look better than ever before. The metal parts are thicker, so they're visible more consistently even when zooming out. There is a bunch of fake shadows inside of the rails to make them generally look less flat. The layering of individual pieces is even trickier and more hideous than before. The ground integration just fits much better, and many more tiny improvements have been applied. Of course, new issues, which the old rails didn't have, appeared, especially around combining the rail pieces together, as every single rail can now just fork into 3 other rails. Meaning I, for example, spent literally weeks rearranging the wooden ties bit by bit in a maddening process, but now the different rail pieces fit together really well. By wooden ties, I normally call them sleepers. I don't know if that's like the proper term, but it's the bits of wood that the rail pieces of rail sit on. And it wasn't just the rails, there was a following avalanche of things we needed to update to fit the new rails. Rail endings, train stops, all the remnants, rail segment visualization graphics, the graphics and the system for rail signal candidate spot visualization had to change. Rail signals with so many new directions that even the circuit connector, the yellow box, needed new directions, and I'm probably still forgetting something. I'm thankful beyond description to Jersey from our 3D artists, who bravely handled the entirety of this avalanche so I could move on to other tasks and retain at least some trace of sanity. We were quite aware of the amount of things that would need changing. Some of it we've already done in the process of updating the rail graphics to high resolution in 2016. Some of it were new features added over time, like the rail signal, rail segment helper overlays. Naturally, you would expect that since we already have systems for all of this graphics process, it would be going faster than last time. The catch is, our quality standards have also kept increasing as we always find some things to improve, so the entire process still took several months to implement. There are a lot of technical problems that Boskid and Kovritz had to handle. In particular, making the rail planner behave even when it has many more rail pieces to choose from was quite difficult. In the end, I am truly convinced all of this was worth it, and I believe you will feel the same way once you get to play with it. So yeah, I'm not sure about the behaving rail planner. I don't think the rail planner behaves particularly well at the start, but I understand the point. Basically, because you've now got multiple, ways of spline fitting a curve basically around between 2 points. How does it pick? What method does it use to say, right, well, this is always the curve I'm going to do, and doesn't flick around between multiple options. Unfortunately, that's what the current rail planner does, so hopefully they've improved it generally. The new rails are coming as a free update to Factorio 2.0, even without Space Age. As you can probably guess, the new rail curves will be incompatible with the old ones. Save games from 1.1 can be opened and trains will still run on previously built rails just like normal, but you won't be able to construct the old rails at all anymore. In some future Factorio update, when we decide to drop 1.1 save game compatibility, let's say 2.1, we will eventually get rid of the old rail shapes completely. As always, we are thrilled to read and respond to the thoughts you express in the usual places. Okay, so overall thoughts then. I just think this is amazing. I don't have a lot of speculation really to go through, so my reactions are just really positive. This has always been a real frustration point for me. It's just annoying that you can't have certain ways of laying out rail, and not discovering that you need to completely redo your entire rail because you can't do a curve has always just been really, really tedious. This also brings me to probably the sole piece of speculation I've got, or the sole point I've really got, is that there's a place called Clapham Junction, which is a rail. It's a railway station, but it has, the reason it's called Clapham Junction is that it's just outside of London, and it has loads of rail going into it. The Waterloo and several major London rail stations are past this, and it's the major rail route into London for commuters and in the south and southeast of England. So it's a really, really large number of rail pieces coming in, and I love this stuff. To me, this is what rails are, and you can't really do this in Factorio. You can get vaguely close, but the fact that, for example, what we're basically saying is that this curve that you got here is like the only curve you've got, and if you look around at these various pieces of rail, they're doing all sorts of stuff. They're going all over the place. And yeah, so this gives you that option then of doing like just loads and loads and loads of connections and interweaving. And I'm sure it'll drive some people to despair. They'll hate that because it's irregular and random. But I can't wait. I'm not saying that my normal playthroughs will have this sort of thing, but having a rail stop, a rail drop-off point that lets you do this kind of mad, interconnecting rail pieces. I'm so looking forward to being able to mess around with that. It does mean, this basically kills. People have been commenting about it on Reddit and stuff, that it kills everyone's blueprints. I think people's blueprints were dead a while ago because things like quality and the bots, changes to bots and stuff mean that, this is what I'm saying, that it's not Factorio 2, but it's Factorio 2. This is real overhaul stuff going on, keeping all of the same mechanics and, the game name and all that sort of stuff. But it's a new version of the game. Some of these changes, I'm sort of realising that I think my aesthetic series is going to get killed off. I might have to just shortcut it and get it done because, rail is going to be changing and, I want to take advantage of that. So there may be a aesthetic version 2.0 or aesthetic series version series 2.0 where, I take advantage of a lot of this stuff. Yeah, so this is possibly the Easter egg, or it could just be accidentally left. But if you look, absolutely no other inserter is active or doing anything. All of these inserters are in their idle state. They're not doing anything. And then you've got one inserter that is doing an insertion. And what it appears to be doing an insertion of is some sort of logic. What should we call it? I can't remember what you call them. The decider combinators and arithmetic combinators. Whether it's a new one of those or a new function for those isn't entirely clear. I wonder if I can zoom in a bit more as well. It becomes indistinct, but you can see it quite well in that sort of zoom. But basically, this has some kind of other symbol on it. It looks like it's like a sawtooth or like a triangle that's being displayed. It could just be because it's being zoomed up a load. But, I've never seen a combinator doing something like that. So is there a whole new thing coming on for logic? It would make a lot of sense if you're firing rockets to space stations and, sending spaceships out and colonizing planets and having more stuff to play with for the logic system would make a lot of sense. And being able to sort of input sine waves and things like that into the logic system would be interesting. I don't know what the applications for that would be. But yeah, it is interesting that this appears to be the only active inserter, if you see what I mean. It's only one holding something and doing something. So maybe that's a little Easter egg, or it could just be a graphical artifact and it's just a normal combinator that just looks weird because of the circumstance. So not anything. I hope you enjoyed today's Friday Facts video and might consider coming back for another one. If you want to join in the live speculation, then you can find me live streaming Factorio every Saturday over on my Twitch channel at Trismegistus. Thanks for watching. Cheers.